Hi, this is Vince Fakhoury Horn, and unfortunately was not able to be present with you all in person this week, having recovered from COVID only recently, and having a family who also just had COVID. So, but that said, I am happy to be able to share some remarks with you on the topic of the panel that I was invited to, which is on digital Dharma and virtual Sangha. And what I thought might be a helpful offering is to just touch on some kind of larger technology trends that I'm aware of on the horizon, in the kind of 5 to 10 year horizon. I think these are going to be some very big trends in terms of shaping culture and shaping kind of future directions that we take, in particular, the Buddha, Dharma, and Sangha. So today I want to just touch on 3 trends. 2 of them I'll go into more depth on a little bit. The one I'm not going to say much about, which is the first trend of artificial intelligence and machine learning. And namely, I'm not going to say much on that because there's a panelist who I think is going to be much better equipped to do that. And so we'll defer to Nikki, whose area of expertise is in AI and machine learning, to talk about the implications of that trend. But I do want to just briefly touch on 2 others, the second being mixed reality. This is an exponential tech trend that I think is going to pretty much shape and change how we are interfacing with digital, virtual, environments. Will radically change them. In fact, the biggest shift that's coming is the development of what's called augmented reality. And of course, we kind of have some early versions of this with our smartphones, but they're nothing like what it's going to be like when we can wear computers on our faces daily, and in which the digital environment will have escaped from the confines of these screens. You can look at, that's a positive way of looking at it, by the way. The negative way of looking at it, saying the screens are going to take over everything, right? But, looking at it, the positive side of it is that no longer will we have to constrict our attention into these small screens. We can actually let our attention become as big as our sensory fields themselves, the visual and auditory sense fields, because these new augmented reality technologies are meant to blend the virtual completely with our visual and auditory senses. And these are, of course, 2 very important senses. They're not the full of our sensory experience, right? So notice how there is still a gap between the analog and digital in terms of the integration, but it's a more blended or more integrated technology, bringing the analog and the digital more closely together. Now, this itself will be fraught, this process. And so there's an opportunity perhaps among Buddhists to think about how we can more wisely utilize these blended spaces, how we can use them for our own ends, yes, but also how we might develop programs or even help develop the very interfaces themselves that are now allowing us to bring together virtual and analog, bringing together the digital and bringing together the in-person, such that they become mixed or blended. And my hope is eventually that they could become more of a non-dualistic experience, one in which they don't seem to be so much in opposition. And that's a good segue, actually, to the third trend, which is Web 3, or the decentralized web. Web 3 is usually associated with things like Bitcoin. And while that is certainly part of Web 3, a big part of what's called decentralized finance, that in some sense is only kind of, to me, the starting point of a much more interesting conversation about what's happening at the fringes of this decentralized web movement, which itself, I just want to mention, is built on the idea of data dignity. This new web is built on the notion that, hey, we made a mistake when we created an internet where the default position was that the companies running our web services for us own our data by default and can choose to do with it what they will. And that we as a user have to agree to that in order to even use these services. Web 3 is trying to turn that logic around and say this new web is built on data dignity, in which you own your own data by default, and you get to choose who and where to share that data. And that the internet itself and the infrastructure, the way that it's developed, is built around that. So this is important. This is important for privacy. It's important for people who live in environments where they're politically persecuted. It's important for people who live in environments where their finances are incredibly unstable, who've been living for perhaps generations with unstable finances. This represents a potential even for the emergence of what's called regenerative finance or regenerative crypto economics. There are, in fact, a number of people and groups who are working at the kind of edges of this movement, trying to turn the hyper-capitalism and hyper-greed, and instead looking for a new way, which is more regenerative. There's a great podcast here, if you want to go deeper into this, called Green Pilled, that launched a few months ago. The host is named Kevin Owocki. He's a technologist and Dharma practitioner, and he's really doing a good job of highlighting some of the amazing projects happening in this space, in the regenerative crypto economic space. And so I think we could think about ways that Buddhists, right, could bring Buddhist economic principles, Buddhist principles into new programmed economics. We could think about ways to take other new economic systems like donut economics and have them be encoded into bioregional currencies, for instance. All of these become possible on Web3, but only if we build them, only if we support those builders. DAOs, this is another interesting emergence part of Web3. Bitcoin was the first DAO, decentralized autonomous organization. And interesting that they ended up being called DAOs, right? And these are transnational collectives, digital collectives that exist not limited to any particular national space, that are self-organizing. Sometimes they're just self-organizing to like buy artwork and try to make money, like investment DAOs. But other DAOs are organizing for different kinds of purposes. And we can imagine Dharmic DAOs, Buddhist DAOs. In fact, Sangha DAO, which launched recently out of a conversation that I had with this fellow Kevin Owocki, who I mentioned earlier, has become a group of hundreds of people who are now self-organizing, trying to, figure out how to bring Dharma and Web3 together.